Hello, my name is Doug Jensen. If you've owned a professional Sony video camera during the last 15 years, then maybe you've seen one of my dozens of masterclass training videos or read one of the field guide books that I've written to help colleagues, such as yourself, get the best performance from their camera. I'm happy to announce that I've just published a 400-page in-depth guide for the revolutionary Sony PXW-Z750 and Z450 camcorders. If you've been waiting for a camera that will not only improve the quality of your images, but also allow you to work faster and more efficiently than ever before, then you may have just found the answer. I know I have. Please don't let the outward appearance of my Z750 deceive you. This is not your daddy's Betacam or an old F800 XT-Cam from 10 years ago. This is the cutting-edge, high-performance 4K television camera that many professionals, myself included, have been dreaming of for almost a decade. Even though cinema-style cameras, DSLRs, and mirrorless cameras seem to get the lion's share of attention these days, for many types of productions, there is simply no other camera design that is as fast to work with or as versatile as a shoulder-mount camcorder with 2/3 inch sensors and a B4 lens mount. Now, what's so magical about 2/3 inch camcorders, and why do I say the Z750 and Z450 are revolutionary? Well, that's the subject of this video. Give me a few minutes of your time and I'll show you exactly why these two cameras are unlike anything else on the market today. You know, as a freelancer who has owned his own cameras, audio equipment, and lighting gear for more than 35 years, one thing I've learned is that it's vitally important to change with the times and stay ahead of the curve when it comes to new technology. From 2009 to 2013, my primary camera was the highly respected Sony PDW F800. Although it was HD, tapeless, and a real workhorse camera, I could see that my high-end work was starting to trend towards 4K acquisition, higher frame rates, 10-bit 422 recording formats, and of course, S-Log. All features that did not exist on my F800 or any other 2/3 inch ENG camera for that matter. It turns out that building high-performance 4K 2/3 inch CMOS sensors and putting them into a shoulder mount camcorder proved to be a huge engineering challenge, and so development of a 4K ENG camera to replace the F800 was slow. In the meantime, many of us had no choice but to make the jump to cinema-style cameras while we waited for the camera that we really wanted. Or I should say needed, because there's no denying that this type of camera is just about perfect for any shooting environment where speed and versatility are paramount. So, it was a bittersweet day in 2013 when I sold my F800 and replaced it with a PMW F55 cinema-style camera. The F55 is a beautiful camera and had all the latest technological specifications I needed to stay competitive. But unfortunately, it also meant giving up many features that I had taken for granted with my previous cameras. I don't know what features you look for in a camera, but I want a camera that can go straight from its case onto my shoulder and to a tripod and back to the case instantly with no assembly, disassembly, or futzing around with extra accessories. I want a well-balanced camera with an adjustable built-in shoulder pad so I can shoot for hours at a time without fatigue. I don't want to spend valuable production time dealing with gimbals, stabilizers, easy rigs, or other hardware that shouldn't be needed for routine shooting situations. I want a camera that has 2/3 inch sensors and a native B4 lens mount so I can shoot wide shots, extreme telephoto, close-ups, macro, and news magazine style interviews that have shallow depth of field without ever changing lenses. I want a camera that has global shutter, S-Log, 4K resolution, and a variety of high-end 60p, 10-bit 422 recording formats to choose from, while also offering the industry standard XT-Cam HD 422 format that broadcast clients frequently require. I want a camera that has a beautiful high-resolution OLED viewfinder for precise on-the-fly focusing. I want a camera that can record 4 different audio sources simultaneously with 2 XLR audio jacks at the rear, a 5-pin connector up front for a stereo shotgun microphone, and a built-in slot for a dual-channel wireless audio receiver. I want a camera that has built-in ND filters, several customizable assign switches, external controls for white balance, gain, shutter speed, headphone volume, and all 4 channels of audio, plus VU meters on the side of the camera body where I can see them at a glance. And finally, I want a camera that has been given the all-important stamp of approval for use as the primary camera for Netflix original productions, thus putting to rest any doubts from clients that a 4K 2/3 inch camera is capable of producing outstanding images in all kinds of shooting situations. As you may have guessed, my Z750 checks all of those boxes, plus it comes with many other amazing capabilities and unexpected features that I'm looking forward to telling you about during the rest of this video, so stay tuned. But don't get me wrong, I'm certainly not against big sensor cinema-style cameras. They are often good choices for interviews, theatrical film production, and other situations where very shallow depth of field is desired. Personally, I've owned or still own a Sony f55, an FS7, an FS5, a Canon 5D Mark IV, a Sony A7, a Panasonic S1H, and a full array of very nice and expensive lenses, and I don't regret buying any of them. But for run-and-gun documentaries, B-roll, news, sports, wildlife, event production, unscripted reality TV, stock footage, and about 95% of what I typically shoot, using a cinema-style camera has often felt like I'm working with a ball and chain attached to my ankle and one arm tied behind my back. To say I'm excited about my Z750 would be a gross understatement. Although all other manufacturers seem to have given up on building 2/3 inch 4K camcorders, Sony has actually gone ahead and delivered the camera that many of us have been waiting years for. The Z750 is a sophisticated hybrid. It combines the classic design characteristics of a traditional shoulder mount ENG camera that has a native B4 lens mount with the high-end technical specifications and capabilities of today's best cinema cameras. The net result is an amazingly robust and flexible camera that allows me to work faster, more efficiently, and to capture a wide range of images without having to stop and change lenses all the time. In fact, because the Z750 and Z450 both offer S-Log3 and the same 4K 10-bit xavc codecs that are found on Sony's cinema cameras, they can be seamlessly integrated into productions that utilize both types of cameras. But that's not all. Because the Z750 shares its lineage with the highly regarded Sony HDC 3500 and 5500 live production cameras, the camera is just as at home working in broadcasting environments where post-production grading may or may not be part of the workflow. It sounds like a cliche to say that the Z750 is the Swiss Army knife of cameras, but that's really what it is. If there's a more versatile camera than the Z750, I have no idea what it would be. Of course, the main thing you give up with a 2/3 inch camera as compared to a cinema-style camera is super shallow depth of field. Due to the smaller sensor size of the Z750, it can be challenging to match the look you can get with a cinema-style camera and a fast lens. Obviously, shooting with super shallow depth of field is not what the Z750 and Z450 are designed to do best. And you can either look at that as a handicap, or you can do as I do and embrace it as one of the camera's many advantages. These cameras are intended to be used for shooting situations where extremely shallow cinematic depth of field might actually be a drawback, and when changing lenses frequently is simply not practical. Personally, I find the shallow depth of field look I can get with my Z750 to be perfectly acceptable for just about everything I shoot, including sit-down interviews. I mean, I don't really want my interviews to have backgrounds that are so out of focus they start to look like green screen graphics. In my opinion, it is certainly possible to take the shallow depth of field look too far. And with that said, the difference between the Z750 and a super 35mm camera, such as an f55 or FS7, may not be as big as you think anyway. For example, a fairly typical interview for me with my Z750 would be the camera located 10 feet from the subject, the focal length zoomed to about 40mm, and the aperture set to f2.0. That combination of settings gives me a depth of field of about 6 inches, which is shallow enough to look nice, yet still allows me to keep the person safely in focus when they inevitably start shifting around during the interview. Now, in order to match that shot with my f55, while keeping the camera at the same distance from the subject and having the same amount of depth of field, I'd need to shoot the interview with a 95mm lens set to f4.5. On the left, you see the Z750, and on the right, the f55. Granted, the framing isn't exactly the same and the white balance hasn't been matched very well, but I think the shots are close enough to show that there isn't any meaningful depth of field difference between the two cameras. The Z750 and a normal ENG lens can achieve similar shallow depth of field to a super 35mm camera that has a lens set to f4.5. And I know for a fact there are a lot of people using super 35mm cameras with f4 lenses. Now obviously the f55 can go even shallower if I were to open up the iris to f2.8 or maybe even f2.0. So I'm certainly not saying that the Z750 can match the look of a cinema style camera in all instances. There's no question that a super 35mm or full frame camera with a nice fast lens can provide shallower depth of field if you really want it, and can handle the challenges of keeping the subject in focus when he or she moves. My point with this demonstration is that the difference between a 2/3 inch camera and a super 35mm camera is not as significant as many people assume. The bottom line is that if super shallow depth of field is your #1 priority, and that one factor alone outweighs all the other advantages of an ENG camera, then neither the Z750 nor Z450 is probably going to be the right camera for you. And that's fine. That's exactly why there are so many different cameras for us all to choose from. Unlike other cameras, where frequently changing lenses is normal and an accepted burden, that is not the case with ENG cameras. Many camcorders will go their entire lifetime having only used one lens. Now this approach works because 2/3 inch B4 lenses have amazingly large zoom ratios that make it possible for a single lens to cover a wide range of shooting situations. For instance, I've chosen to pair my Z750 with this Fujinon UA 24x7.8 f1.8 lens, which is comparable to a 20mm to 468mm f1.8 lens on a super 35mm camera. However, such a lens doesn't exist for cinema cameras, and if it did, you wouldn't be able to afford one or shoot handheld because it'd be enormous and very heavy. But the advantages of a 2/3 inch lens get even better. Most ENG lenses, including this one, have a built-in 2x optical extender that doubles the maximum focal length at the flip of a lever. In the case of my lens, that makes it the equivalent of a 935mm f4 lens on a super 35mm camera, which makes this lens ideal for sports, reality, wildlife, news, and other situations where moving closer to the subject isn't always an option. In addition to having a great zoom range, my Fujinon lens can focus as close as 30 inches. It has built-in macro focus capability, and the servo control allows me to execute nice, slow, perfectly smooth zooms, which is a shooting style that is nearly impossible with cinema and SLR lenses. I love having the ability once again to quickly change the focal length during an interview without refocusing, or to add a little bit of zooming at just the right moment during a key soundbite. After you've become accustomed to shooting with an ENG lens, it feels very limiting to go back to anything else that doesn't offer the same versatility. Now I could talk about ENG lenses all day, and I do intend on diving deeper into this subject in some upcoming videos. But for now, let's get back to the Z750 and Z450 themselves and take a closer look at what else makes them so special. Now first of all, it's important to know that the Z750 was released about 3 years after the Z450, and not surprisingly, technology had moved forward significantly during that time. Although they both share the same body style, the same weight, the same viewfinders, the same lenses, and 98% of the same menu options and other capabilities, there are some important differences to be aware of. For one thing, the 750 has 3 sensors while the 450 only has 1. The 750 is currently the only 4K camcorder to have a light splitting prism and 3 2/3 inch sensors. 1 chip for red, 1 chip for blue, and 1 chip for green, which is exactly how all 2/3 inch CCD video cameras were manufactured for decades. Now having 3 chips basically triples the image capture area and also offers twice as many red and blue photo sites as a single sensor camera, which largely accounts for why the 750 can compete with cinema-style cameras that only have 1 sensor. In terms of real-world performance, the 750 has better sensitivity, lower noise, and overall better picture quality than the 450. But on the other hand, having only a single sensor gives the 450 much lower power consumption, 24 watts versus 43 watts. Obviously, it's the sensors that account for the biggest power draw in a camera. Only the Z750 has a global shutter. Most CMOS sensors use a rolling shutter that scans through the photosites line by line from top to bottom. Now that line-by-line scanning can result in the appearance of unwanted artifacts, such as skewed vertical lines in scenes with lots of motion, or partially exposed frames, known as flash banding, when shooting lightning, camera strobes, or other very short bursts of light. Some CMOS cameras exhibit rolling shutter artifacts more than others, and I think Sony does a very good job of mitigating this problem in all of their professional video cameras. So with a high-end camera like the 450, which does have a rolling shutter, you might never notice any issues during normal shooting. But if you want to completely eliminate the risk of rolling shutter artifacts, then you need to shoot with a camera such as the Z750 that has a global shutter. The 750 captures the entire frame all at once, like a snapshot, instead of progressively from top to bottom. This is a superior method of capturing video and one of the Z750's biggest advantages for sports, reality TV, and wildlife shooting where high-speed action is the norm. Both the 750 and 450 have the ability to shoot beautiful slow-motion video at up to 60 frames per second in HD or 4K with 10-bit 422 color. But only the 750 has the added capability of shooting at up to 120 frames per second in HD, using a cropped sensor mode. Now, if you've ever shot with an f/55 or FS7, then you may be familiar with the center scan mode found on those cameras, which uses only the middle 50% of the 4K sensor for HD shooting. Well, the Z750 does the exact same thing whenever a frame rate faster than 60 frames per second is selected. One advantage of the HFR mode is that it gives you the equivalent of a 2x optical extender with no loss of light. For example, this 22 by 8 millimeter Fujinon lens becomes the equivalent of a 22 by 16 millimeter lens during HFR shooting. For the most part, any recording format that is available on one camera is also available on the other. That includes all combinations of 4K, HD, 30p, 24p, 60p, 50p, 25p, xavc-I, xavc-L, XDCAM HD 422, and more. But there are two notable differences. First, only the 450 has standard definition recording formats, not that you'll ever need them. And second, only the 750 offers Sony's latest and greatest recording format called xavc-L 200. In fact, because this codec is so new, the 750 is the first and the only camera in the world right now to offer xavc-L 200. Now, what makes this format so noteworthy is that, much like the 750 itself, it's a hybrid. On the one hand, it's a very efficient long-GOP codec that records 60p 4K at just 200 megabits per second. But on the other hand, it captures 10-bit 422 color, just like Sony's xavc-I intraframe codecs. So you get the best of both worlds. High-end color resolution, but with very small file sizes, thus making xavc-L 200 an ideal choice for HDR productions that have high shooting ratios, such as multicam reality shows, documentaries, and sports. 8-bit 420 codecs are perfectly fine for any footage that will go straight from the camera to air with only minor touch-ups in post. But for green screen, S-Log, HLG, or any footage that will require heavy grading, you absolutely need to work with 10-bit 422 files if you want to ensure high-quality results. And even though it's a new codec, you won't run into any compatibility issues in post. xavc-L 200 already works with all the major NLEs, including Resolve, Premiere, Avid, and Final Cut Pro. xavc-L 200 clips are about 1/3 the size of their xavc-I counterparts while still maintaining excellent picture quality. And keep in mind that xavc-I is already twice as efficient as ProRes 422 and 3 times more efficient than ProRes 422 HQ. So that makes xavc-L 200 even more impressive. There are several other minor differences between the 750 and the 450 that you can read about in my book, but for the most part, we've covered the ones that matter most, so let's move ahead. Just to keep things simple, I'm going to focus on the 750 from here on out, but be aware that almost everything I tell you also applies to the 450. Many cameras from other manufacturers lack the sophisticated paint menus that are necessary to customize the look of the picture to suit your own needs. So you either have to settle for the look that the camera gives you out of the box, or switch over to a neutral log mode and then color grade in post to get an acceptable image. But the 750 gives you a choice. You can either use the dozens of paint menus to grade in camera at the time of shooting and capture images that are good enough to go straight to air, or you can choose neutral S-Log3 settings, the same as Sony's cinema cameras, and then color grade the footage in post to look however you want. And contrary to what some people think, neither workflow is necessarily better than the other, and it's great to be able to allow clients to choose the shooting mode that works best for them. Both the 750 and the 450 also offer a hybrid log gamma mode known as HLG. So if you want to get technical about it, you actually have 3 different shooting modes to choose from. In my Z750 book, I provide specific paint menu settings, white balancing techniques, and exposure recommendations for 5 different custom scene files that are designed to be used in different types of shooting situations. You can even download the scene files and load them straight into your camera if you don't want to enter the individual settings manually. If you haven't seen the documentary on Vimeo called The Camera That Changed the World, you really should take a look. It tells the story of 2 groups of filmmakers and engineers who, 60 years ago, designed and built the first shoulder-mount 16mm film cameras that gave documentary shooters the freedom to move quickly and capture real-life events as they actually unfolded. Today, we take the cinema verite shooting style for granted, but 60 years ago, it was revolutionary, and many of the best documentaries of the 1960s and 70s wouldn't have been possible without those cameras. News and sports shooters worldwide quickly adopted those cameras for run-and-gun shooting. And that led to the development of the first ENG cameras, which had video recorders connected by an umbilical cable. And that evolved into the one-piece Betacam, and that led to the first generation of tapeless ENG cameras in the mid-2000s, such as my old F800. But no matter which brand or model of professional video camera you used in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, the ergonomics were all similar. They all had the same basic shape, they all handled the same way, they were compatible with the same lenses, and all of the important controls were basically located in the same places. Nobody questioned the design of the Betacam style camera or tried to improve on it because it had evolved to the point where it was already pretty much perfect the way it was. But about 10 years ago, all that changed. Camera functionality and ergonomics went off the rails, and the proven shoulder mount design was thrown out the window. Today, there's no uniformity, no standard features or functions that you can count on. Every camera is different, and operators are forced to spend time and money jumping through hoop after hoop in an endless quest to recreate what had already been perfected. Shooting with a Franken camera rig like these would have been totally unacceptable 10 years ago, but now some people accept them as perfectly normal. Alright, maybe I sound like some geezer who is nostalgic for the good old days, but believe me, I've worked with enough cameras over the years that I can say, with no reservations, that this is just about the perfect camera design, and I don't think anybody is going to improve on it anytime soon. The shoulder pad can be adjusted for perfect comfort. The weight of the lens out front is counterbalanced by the weight of the battery at the rear, with 90% of the weight being borne by your shoulder instead of your arm. And as any experienced camera operator will attest, having the camera properly balanced is far more important for comfort and steadiness than the overall weight of the camera. Should you ever have the need for mounting a matte box, teleprompter, or other accessories, adding a standard pair of 15mm rods to the camera only requires the use of a simple accessory that doesn't interfere with the ergonomics at all. All ENG zoom lenses have a built-in grip for pointing the camera and holding it steady. Having your right hand right up against the lens provides far better leverage and stability than a grip that comes down closer to your chest. Plus, there's no need for extra extension arms or other accessories that always get in the way when you want to set the camera down on the ground or put it back into its case. Built-in connectors for a carrying strap make it easy to sling the camera over your shoulder whenever you need to change locations. And finally, we come to the viewfinder. Obviously, the main purpose of the viewfinder is to monitor what you're shooting, but on an ENG camera, it also provides an additional point of contact for steadiness. You've got the weight of the camera resting on your shoulder, your right hand on the lens, the side of your head against the camera body, and your eye socket against the viewfinder. 4 points of contact that make it easy for anyone to comfortably hold the camera rock steady for long periods of time. Speaking of viewfinders, the Z750 is compatible with 2 of the best OLED viewfinders I've ever seen. Sony's HD VF EL30 and EL20. They both put the $12,000 color LCD viewfinder I used on my F800 that I thought was great at the time to shame. Now the advantage of an OLED screen is that it has pure blacks, excellent contrast, and a wider dynamic range than LCDs. In fact, the EL30 and EL20 are also the recommended viewfinders for Sony's top-of-the-line Venice Cinema camera, so you know they have to be very good. The two viewfinders are identical in most regards, but the EL30 comes equipped with an additional 3.5-inch flip-up LCD screen and built-in sunshade. The LCD can be rotated and tilted to almost any angle, which makes it very handy for low-angle shooting, jibs, sliders, dollies, and other shooting situations where you don't want to have your face pressed up against the eye cup. And yes, both the flip-up LCD screen and the regular OLED viewfinder can be used at the same time. Now, in addition to having external controls for peaking, contrast, brightness, and zebras, the EL30 and EL20 are so sophisticated they each have their own assigned buttons and their own built-in menu system with dozens of parameters that can be customized to suit your individual preferences. For example, just with peaking alone, there are dozens of different possible combinations of settings that allow the operator to fine-tune the performance to work exactly how they want it. Not surprisingly, I felt it was a good idea to devote an entire chapter of my book just to configuring and operating the two viewfinders. How many slots for memory cards do you think a professional camera should have? 1, 2, well how about 4? Because that's what comes standard on the Z750. Sony has built the camera on the rock-solid foundation of SxS memory cards. Now, I've been shooting on SxS cards since 2007, and in all of those years, not once have I experienced so much as a single drop frame, let alone any other kind of card failure or clip corruption. One reason for their reliable performance is that SxS cards have built-in error correction and power failure management to protect the files in the event of glitches, battery problems, or other mishaps. In my opinion, the most underappreciated benefit of SxS cards is the peace of mind they provide. However, if you're on a budget, it's also possible to use XQD cards and SDXC cards with optional adapters. But be aware that the use of those types of cards, especially SDXC cards, does come with some recording format limitations, which I talk about in my book. Also, Sony's XQD adapters have been discontinued, so you may have trouble finding one if you don't already own one. A very cool thing about the 750 is that you can attach any USB storage device, including portable hard drives and even thumb drives, to one of the camera's USB ports and copy files directly from the camera's internal memory cards to the external drive without using a computer. And here's something that might blow your socks off. Sony's latest generation of SxS cards, called Pro-X, can deliver 3 times faster ingest speeds compared to previous cards when used with Sony's new Thunderbolt 3 reader. This means that you can ingest the contents of a full 240 gigabyte card in about 3.5 minutes. That is truly amazing. I remember when we used to think that 20 minutes to ingest an 8 gigabyte card was acceptable. And just to give you a point of reference, a 240 gigabyte card can hold about 90 minutes of 4K xavc 30p footage, or 110 minutes of 4K xavc 24p footage, or a whopping 560 minutes of XDCAM HD 422 footage. That's more than 7.5 hours of high-definition raw footage that can be ingested in just 3.5 minutes. Amazing. The camera's third card slot is located here, but its purpose is not to record video. This slot is for an SD utility card, which can be used to store 6 different types of data files that contain various setup parameters for your camera. The ability to store all files, scene files, lens files, custom gamma files, reference files, and user files on a dedicated utility card located in its own special slot, so it's always on board the camera, is a huge advantage compared to other cameras. Not only does the utility card provide a backup of all your settings for safekeeping, they also make it easy to clone cameras. For example, if you walked in the door right now and handed me another Z750, I could have it set up exactly like mine in about 20 seconds. And if you rent cameras or use a camera that is shared by other people, or if you have multiple cameras to oversee, there are even more reasons to take advantage of these data files. The fourth card slot is used exclusively for recording proxy files on inexpensive SD cards. Proxy recording is a powerful feature that allows you to record two files at once with similar file names, the same duration, and the same timecode numbers. The big difference between the two files is that one is full resolution and the other is a fraction of that size. And the quality of the image looks pretty darn good. Check out this example of a proxy file next to the full resolution file. It's even hard to tell the difference when viewed at 100% magnification. Proxy files are the perfect solution for faster file transfers, rough cuts, shot logging, and file sharing over the web. It's even possible to configure the camera so that proxy files are automatically transferred to a specified server, perhaps back at a TV station, as soon as the stop button is pressed to end recording. On some cameras, such as the F55, proxy files are saved in a special folder on the same SxS card as the full resolution files. But it's much more convenient to have proxy files stored on a separate, standalone SD card, which can then be easily ejected and handed off to a producer or a client at the end of a shoot. In fact, you can record a whole day's worth of footage on a $10 SD card. Another cool feature that is easy to overlook is the camera's ability to only record proxy files without recording the corresponding full resolution file, which I guess if you want to get technical about it would mean that the proxy isn't even actually a proxy anymore. For example, I have the online button on my camera programmed to start and stop proxy recording only. This is a great way of allowing the camera to keep recording non-stop to ensure I don't miss an unexpected moment. It can be especially helpful when shooting a documentary or perhaps while setting up for an interview while the talent is still getting ready. You never know what you might get. The 9 megabit per second rate of the proxy isn't ideal, but it's still higher than the bitrate of Netflix streaming, which looks pretty good, right? I think this ability to allow the camera to record for hours and hours on a cheap little SD card is a very cool trick to have in my toolbox. No matter how Sony or any other manufacturer decides to organize the menus of their cameras, they'll never be able to satisfy everyone. And that's why Sony allows you to create your own custom menu page with up to 19 of your most frequently used functions located in one central location and sorted in whatever order you choose. A cool feature is the ability to lock the menu system so that only the custom menu page can be accessed. For example, a television station with many cameras deployed out in the field may want to limit which menus the photogs are permitted to change. So in that case, they would create a custom page that only contains those menus. Now this feature is also useful for large-scale productions that have many cameras out in the field, production companies with inexperienced operators, or anyone else who wants to prevent other people from screwing around with all but a few of the camera settings. As long as we're on the subject of cool things the camera can do, let's take a quick look at a few more features that you're probably never going to read about in a brochure or on Sony's website. Yet many of them make my job so much easier during shooting and more efficient in post. If you've shot with other Sony cameras, then maybe some of these will sound familiar, but then again, a lot of them might be totally new to you. In addition to the normal proxy mode that I just spoke about, the camera can also be configured to record full resolution 4K clips and matching HD clips simultaneously to the same SxS card. You have two options for the HD codec, either MPEG HD 42250, which is the de facto broadcast standard around the world, or xavc L50, which is also a broadcast quality codec. This is a great way to capture full resolution HD files for today's edit while putting 4K versions into the archives for future use. But that's not all. When you're shooting with an HD format, you can set up the camera to record identical clips onto both SxS cards at once, A and B. Another interesting feature is called Clip Continuous Record. Normally, as with all cameras, a new clip is created as an independent file each time you start recording. But Clip Continuous Record allows you to start and stop recording as often as you want to without creating any new clips. The camera just keeps adding on to the end of one long clip for as long as the function remains enabled. Like several other Sony camcorders, the Z750 allows you to program exactly how clips will be named on board the camera at the time of shooting, rather than just using a random string of characters or a numbering system that automatically resets itself back to 0 every time you format a new card. It takes me just a few seconds at the beginning of the day to program a custom name that will help identify the shoot or the project that I'm working on, such as Jones Interview or Camera 1 Day 2. This feature is a great time saver in post when it comes to organizing, managing, and searching for clips in my vast library of footage. A second advantage of custom clip naming is that I can display the file name of the current clip in the viewfinder and on a client's monitor while I'm shooting. So rather than taking notes that are based on unwieldy timecode numbers, clients and crew can simply write down the actual name of a clip. Later in post during editing, it's a whole lot faster to locate specific shots or takes based on the actual name of the file rather than the old-fashioned method of trying to hunt down a certain timecode number. Another cool feature is the ability to delete bad takes on the fly like they never even existed. It's a little like doing a rough cut at the time of shooting because you're throwing away stuff that you already know you'll never need in post. For example, maybe the talent flubbed their line, or an airplane flew over in the middle of the take, or you bobbled the camera on some B-roll, or something else went wrong. Why shouldn't you erase those useless clips right then and there? Not only does deleting unwanted clips free up space on the memory cards, it also reduces the amount of footage that will have to be ingested, backed up, archived, logged, and sifted through during editing. I've got my camera programmed so that deleting the last clip only requires pressing 2 buttons. It can be done in less than 7 seconds with no time wasted drilling down into the playback mode, and then I'm ready to roll again instantly. As a safety measure, the camera will only allow me to delete the very last clip that was recorded. So after I've executed the last clip delete function, it can't be used again until after I record another clip. On productions where I'm shooting with on-camera talent, I'm usually able to cut my raw footage down by at least 50%. Sometimes a lot more than that if the talent isn't very good. And that gives me a huge workflow advantage in post. In case you haven't noticed, speed and efficiency are vitally important to me, whether I'm shooting for a client or working on one of my own productions. Everything I do, from the camera I've chosen, to the lens I use, to the way the camera is configured, is all designed to help me work faster, more efficiently, and be more productive than the next guy. I know it's a cliche to say it, but time really is money. As I've mentioned before, the 750 has dozens of paint menus that allow you to precisely control the look of the camera's picture, meaning that you basically have the power to color grade your footage on board the camera at the time of shooting. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of those settings here, but one new feature that I want to bring to your attention is Sony's proprietary noise suppression algorithm, which works surprisingly well in the shadows and darker areas of the image, particularly when the gain has been raised above 6 dB. While there are some other cameras that also offer user-controlled noise suppression, on the 750, it's not just a setting that is simply turned on or off. The camera allows you to designate how much noise suppression will be applied to the picture at any given time. In other words, you can program the camera so that a different degree of noise suppression is applied at different levels of gain. For example, you may want to apply no noise suppression at 0 dB, a little bit at plus 6 dB, a little more at plus 12 dB, and crank it up to the maximum when the gain is set to plus 42 dB. This is a powerful feature that can really make a difference in low light. In my experience as both a cameraman and an editor, in-camera noise suppression is always going to look better than doing it in post. In addition to being able to record very nice slow motion at up to 60 frames per second in 4K, and up to 120 frames per second in HD, the 750 also offers picture cache with up to 12 seconds of buffering for 4K and up to 15 seconds for HD. Interval recording for shooting time-lapse clips. Shockless gain and shockless white balance for times when you want to change either of those two settings while you're recording, but you want to have the transition be imperceptible to the viewer. And slow speed shutter. Slow shutter, or SLS as it is known for short, is a variable setting that allows you to increase the amount of light the camera captures for each frame of video. Up to 16 frames can be accumulated, thus making the camera 16 times more sensitive to light than it would be without slow shutter turned on. The main purpose of SLS is for shooting stationary shots in low light without cranking up the gain. But it's also a great tool for capturing time-lapse clips that have smooth flowing blurred motion. I'm willing to bet that the Z750 provides more external audio controls and menu options than any camera you've ever used before. If you took away all the video features from the camera, you'd still be left with a pretty impressive audio device that can record 4 channels of high quality 24-bit 48 kHz sound. As I mentioned earlier, there are 5 potential sources of audio input. The 5-pin XLR stereo connector at the front, XLR input number 1 and XLR input number 2 at the rear of the camera, and a slot for a wireless audio receiver that can be used to receive digital signals from 2 transmitters at once. These 5 inputs can be routed without hardly any restrictions at all to any of the 4 channels. Under a protective door, you'll find about a dozen external switches, knobs, and dials for configuring the settings of all 4 channels without having to dive into the menus. The levels of all 4 channels can be monitored on the flip-out LCD screen on the side of the camera. Additionally, channels 1 and 2 can be seen at the bottom of the viewfinder. In the camera's default mode, the recording level of the shotgun mic can be adjusted manually using the recessed recording level knob under the lens, which makes it really easy to adjust levels on the fly during handheld shooting without ever taking your eye away from the viewfinder. The 2 XLR connectors at the rear can be set for regular analog input or digital. When AES EBU is selected, each of the XLR connectors can handle 2 digital audio channels, thus making it possible to bring in 4 different sources using nothing more than these 2 connectors. There's even a 5-pin XLR connector for stereo output and monitoring. Not surprisingly, there's a headphone jack over here. But something you don't see too often anymore, on the side of the camera, there are physical switches for configuring how the 4 audio channels are monitored, plus a headphone volume knob. Imagine that, an external headphone volume knob. If I had told you 10 years ago that in 2020 these features would be unusual, you wouldn't have believed me. Now, like its shoulder mount predecessors, the 750 is equipped with a slot that can accommodate a wireless audio receiver that can provide 2 channels of audio to the camera with no external cables, batteries, or additional power supplies. As you can see, the receiver literally becomes part of the camera, and it only adds about 7 ounces of weight. This wireless system is fully digital throughout the entire signal path, and the sound quality rivals wired microphones. I can monitor the RF signal strength right in the viewfinder, and there's even a secure encrypted transmission mode with password protection for ultimate privacy. Both the transmitters and the receiver have sophisticated menu options that allow you to customize their operation in dozens of different ways. For example, I can press a button on the camera to put the transmitters into power save mode. And I've set up the transmitters so they go to sleep automatically when they detect that the camera has been switched off, and then wake up again when the camera's turned back on. Pretty cool stuff. By the way, if you're on a tight budget or simply don't need the high-end features of the DWX system, Sony has an affordable alternative called the UWP series that has its own dual-channel receiver and belt-pack transmitters. As you've seen throughout this video, the 750 has a boatload of input and output connectors scattered all around the body. Now, we've talked about many of them already, so I'll try not to repeat myself, but there's also a 12-volt D-tap connector to power an on-camera light, such as this light panel's bicolor brick light. Genlock, 1 connector for timecode in and a separate connector for timecode out, so you can daisy chain multiple cameras. A sync output connector. A full-size HDMI connector for 4K or HD output. An Ethernet jack. 2 12G SDI connectors for 4K or HD video output. An 8-pin connector for remote control of the camera. A standard 4-pin XLR for 12-volt power input. A 4-pin Hiroshi connector for 12-volt power output. And perhaps most unusual of all, an HD SDI input connector that essentially turns the camera into a DVR for recording a pool feed or some other HD video source. The final thing I want to talk about in this video is the camera's networking functions, which, to be honest, are features I seldom have any reason to use myself. But if you're a broadcaster or if you're interested in live streaming for any other reason, then the camera has some pretty amazing capabilities. Without buying any extra accessories or spending money on paid services, you can control the camera remotely from a tablet, a smartphone, or a computer. Connect the camera to existing networks via either Ethernet or Wi-Fi. Transfer selected full-resolution files from the camera to a remote server. Transfer selected proxy files from the camera to a remote server. Configure the camera so that proxy files are automatically transmitted as soon as they're recorded. Live stream to your own network or to a social media platform such as YouTube. And you can start and stop streaming instantly just by pressing the online button. If you don't mind adding some additional hardware and/or signing up for some paid services, you can also connect the camera via dual link cellular for streaming and/or file transfer. Live stream high-quality video using the Sony network station. And live stream using Sony's XDCam Air, which is a very robust cloud-based workflow service for news production. As you can see, the Z750 and Z450 really are revolutionary cameras, and I've only scratched the surface of their amazing features and capabilities. As I mentioned earlier, to help flatten the learning curve for other camera operators, I've published a 400-page in-depth book that covers pretty much everything you need to know in order to get up and running quickly with either of these two cameras. Chapters include scene files, S-log, recording formats, audio, live streaming, and everything in between. With over 35 years of experience in television production, I know what information an operator needs to have, what settings on the camera are going to provide the best results, and just as importantly, I know how to teach others what I have spent months learning. So whether you're an owner or a renter or a freelancer hired to operate a Z750 or Z450, I hope my book will give you the inside edge that you need to become quickly proficient with either of these two cameras. Thanks for watching and happy shooting.